was asked to make a keynote on looking at demand for foresight analysis for Africa's agri-food systems transformation. So first, I want to look at food systems being really a lot of things that are happening. I usually tell people there is no one project that should be called food systems, because food systems is about how many things that we do come together in a systems way to deliver on food, nutrition, agriculture goals. And so my first slide, usually when I talk about food systems, it look at the outcomes for us here on the continent. And you can see what has been happening over time in terms of what our food systems have been delivering for us. You can see stunting on the left-hand side, and you can see that we have been seeing some progress. That progress is too slow for us to reach our SDG goals. But when we look at overweight under 5, this is an area where we've been doing quite well. Most African countries are managing to keep that under 5%. And that's our target in our Africa Regional Nutrition Strategy, was our target also in Malabo targets. So some of the work that we are doing around that seems to be working positively, better in some countries than others. But once we get to adolescents, from 5 to 19-year-olds, you can see our problems there. We have moved from 10% overweight and obesity in girls in 2000 to 19%. So we've almost doubled. So something is not going right in our food systems. And then when we get to women, adult women, you can see the problem there. These are continental averages. So if we are now at 45% overweight and obesity on the continent, you can imagine there are countries that are much higher. South Africa stands out at 65% average. The North African countries also are quite badly affected. Similar trends we see in boys and men as well. While this is the situation, we also still have very high prevalence of micronutrient deficiencies. With some, we are seeing progress, as you can see later on. But we are then having increases in diet-related non-communicable diseases, diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, all on an upward trajectory across the entire continent. There is no country that is an exception in this particular case. So this is what our food systems are currently delivering. If you look at this slide, this is from the Global Nutrition Report, just to show you the trends on the African continent. You can see that in terms of childhood stunting, 6 countries are on course. Below that, you can see that 38 are making some progress, and then there are 10 that are making no progress at all. And then if you look at anemia, you can see 17 making some progress. You can see 37 no progress. So across different perspectives of what food systems should be delivering to our populations, we are seeing different things happening. When we switch on to overweight, obesity, and diet-related diseases, then you can see that we are already in trouble. While we haven't completely addressed our undernutrition challenges, we've already started swinging in the other direction. And you can see here that on sodium intake, we have 53 countries off track. 1, no data. And if we were to count 55, I'm sure the 55th will also probably have no data, which is why it's not even listed here. If we looked at raised blood pressure, we can see again same, 53 off track. And we can see again no data for the one that we cannot count. In terms of raised blood pressure for men and women, it's the same thing. So what am I saying here? You can see with diabetes, with hypertension, looking at both men and women, we really are not doing well in terms of our food systems. If this is what our food systems are delivering, when we are thinking about food systems resilience programs, when we are thinking about the Kampala Declaration, these are the issues that we need to turn corners on and move on different trajectories. This is just to look at, since we are in Kenya, food is meant to deliver diets, and we are supposed to be eating a full plate, a diverse plate. And you can see on fruit, not eating enough, vegetables, not eating enough, nuts, not eating enough, whole grains, not eating enough. Across the African continent, the only one that goes on the enough side on whole grains is Ethiopia. And primarily because the staple food injera in Ethiopia is made out of whole grain flour. So there they beat the continent. And then on fish, not enough. On dairy, not enough. So you can see red meat, it really shows that Kenya, it's now bordering on the excess. The question then that we need to ask at country level is, this is a national average. There are those that may be consuming, and there are those that are not having enough. So our scenario analysis would need to address, even at country level, different contexts for different groups of the population if we are to address the equity issue that CAADP Kampala is also referring to. This is the SOFI for 2024. And really, I want you to walk with me from left to right, the world, Asia, then stop at Africa. And you can see red and orange is severe food insecurity and moderate food insecurity. For the African continent, you can see that almost the whole circle is filled up by either severe or moderate food insecurity. The implication, if you continue going all the way to the right, is that Africa is the one that has the biggest gap to fill in terms of food production, to fill in those food insecurity levels. If we have the furthest to go in terms of filling productivity gaps, the implication is that we have a lot more work to do compared to other regions. And Foresight analysis can try to begin to show us what type of trajectories could we take? What must we try? Foresight analysis I see as an opportunity to be able to use modeling to try different scenarios, to see whether we can actually find directions that could take us to the progress we want a lot faster. I was fortunate enough to be part of the Lancet Commission, and here I just want to bring in an aspect of climate perspective to food systems transformation. What we see here is what they are calling planetary boundaries. And these are boundaries around water, environment, climate, nutrients, phosphate boundaries, and nitrogen boundaries. We can see that yellow line on the inside is the planetary boundary. You can see that on many of the boundaries, we have transgressed that boundary. The challenge is as follows. From a food systems perspective, you can see that light green that I have added in, for each one of those boundaries that have been transgressed, that light green is what food systems contribute to those transgressions, implying if we do not transform food systems in a sustainable way, moving in a positive direction, it is not possible for us to remain under 1.5 degrees Celsius that we usually talk about. And this is a continent where we are already in trouble. When you are sitting in some of these big meetings in the global north, and you hear people questioning whether climate change is real or not, I'm yet to see a small-scale farmer on the African continent who does not believe the climate has changed. They themselves will tell you something has changed. So the way in which we are experiencing our food systems on the ground, the realities are such that we are not doubting it anymore. The issue is more, what can we do? Can we accelerate progress to fill our needs in terms of food security within the current climate challenges and environmental challenges that we see? And so foresight should include consideration on how transformation affects some of these key variables. How can we find solutions that can help us produce more food in spite of the climate realities that we are facing, in spite of the environmental realities that we are facing? So you guys that know how to model and try things, the idea is for you to even be disruptive and think of different ways of thinking, model things to try and jilt us into thinking different, that there might be other ways of doing things. Now, we are on a continent that is not lacking of policy instruments. If anything, the African continent is really actually quite rich in policy instruments. If you have time to sit down and read each one of these instruments, you will find just how forward-looking many of them are. So we do have our Agenda 2063, which is of the Africa that we want, and we have the CAADP now Kampala Declaration to help us go there. I see the Kampala Declaration as an overarching thing that even comes over the Food Systems Resilience Program. Food systems resilience programs, whether at country level or East and Southern Africa, the West and Central Africa vision, both are instruments that we can use within the broader Kampala framework to deliver food systems that actually are useful and are delivering for our people. And then so we also have the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Much of what we may be trading there is going to be food and other agricultural produce. So what kind of scenarios can we actually look at there? If you look at, we have the Africa Blue Economy Strategy. That too is within that broader food systems perspective. And let us remind ourselves that CAADP Kampala has taken a food systems approach, building on the common position for food systems on the continent. So whether it's the Africa Blue Economy Strategy or the Africa Biodiversity Strategy, whether it's the Africa Climate Change and Resilience Development Strategy, each one of these are instrumental strategic frameworks for us to work with within the Kampala perspective to deliver the outcomes of food systems that we need to have for the Africa that we want. The implication for foresight analysis is that when we are developing those clever models, you need to think also in terms of not only what is coming out of Kampala directly itself, but what also might be emerging from these other instruments in terms of bringing together a system that can work in a positive direction, a system that can minimize trade-offs that could be minimized so that we can indeed have that Africa that we want. And this is the area where trying scenario analysis becomes very instrumental, because if it's, like I said at the beginning, food system is not any one single activity that you do. Taking a systems approach implies all people that are working across all these different instruments and others that I may not have shown on that slides have the same vision towards which we are all working. If we are delivering more fruits and vegetables, but loaded with pesticides, we are not delivering on the Africa we want, because the pesticides then bring health outcomes, negative health outcomes. If we are to deliver on staple foods, and we have been quite much better at delivering on staple foods on the African continent, but not as good at delivering on the rest of the food basket that we need to be able to deliver those healthy nutrition outcomes that we are looking for. So if we are focused only on staples, again, it means something is missing. So regardless of where each one of us is working within that system, we need to all have a common goal and be thinking of how we are contributing. Are we contributing positively? Is it a trade-off? Can we minimize it if it's the trade-off? And that's where clever people who do foresight analysis could potentially help us. Ethiopia, like other African countries, developed a food systems transformation pathway as part of the UN Food Systems Summit. For us as a continent, we developed a common position which we have now fed to inform the Kampala Declaration. I did introduce myself as being part of an expert group that has worked on the Food Systems Countdown to 2030 initiative. During the UN Food Systems Summit process, one of the questions we had asked is how on earth are we going to monitor food systems transformation over time? And this is how this group came about. We looked at different indicators to see how we can actually monitor food systems transformation, looking at different domains, looking at those trade-offs that I was talking about earlier on. We ended up with 50 indicators. Those indicators were arrived at, when we started, we had 200 indicators. We ended up at 50 because there was a condition. The condition was that for us to use the indicator, it must be available for at least 70 of the UN member states. So for that reason, we ended up with 70 indicators. Now in Ethiopia, as part of developing the UN Food Systems Summit pathway, we also had a draft monitoring and evaluation framework that was suggested. Because we were in a situation where I was both in the Ethiopian process and the global process, we then looked at those 50 indicators, bring them in-house in Ethiopia, look at Ethiopia's transformation pathway, ask questions. How relevant are these indicators to Ethiopia's needs, to Ethiopia's monitoring of its own food systems transformation pathway? At the same time, in talking with the Minister of Agriculture, we were also told they would like to be able to report to CAADP, to SDGs, to nationally determined contribution, using the same list of indicators so that when they collect data, that data can be collected as part of routine data collection for the National Statistical Institute. And so what we have ended up with, in short, is a monitoring and evaluation framework that aligns not just CAADP, but the Food Systems Resilience Program of Ethiopia, the different policy instruments that they have in the country, anything that has anything to do with agriculture, food systems, nutrition, are combined in the same monitoring and evaluation framework, so that you can have this overview of being able to see where potential trade-offs could be. So even the Green Legacy Development initiative that Ethiopia has, we have some indicators that also addresses that as well. Now, we have ended up with a list of indicators that now covers, in this last planning cycle of the Ministry of Agriculture, they've extracted the indicators for the agriculture sector and used them to develop KPI for operations of the ministry. At the same time, there are a list of indicators that will help the country to report on CAADP-BR, so that they won't have to always run around looking for the data when it's time to report. Similarly, there's also indicators to allow the country to report on NDCs as well as on SDGs. And so that is a comprehensive monitoring and evaluation framework. But let me use this to say there is a difference between monitoring and evaluation and foresight analysis. Monitoring and evaluation evaluates you on how you have met your targets that you had set based on what you had planned to do, which is what we do in the CAADP-BR process. We have our indicators, we planned to do something, we check to see whether we have delivered on those commitments, on those targets. That to me is monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and the lessons we learn, then we feed back to help us do better for next time. In foresight analysis allows you to look forward and be a bit more predictive of where you are going. What are the kinds of activities or innovations that would take you to that location? And so within the context of Kampala, we would then have to look at what is it that countries have planned? Can you model around those activities to show whether that takes us where we think we are going to land? And if not, what might need to be changed to make sure that we can land in the destination that we desire? I'm going to use this as a slide of work that we are doing on better diets and nutrition, just to show how complex thinking about food systems can be. First, we need to think about consumers and their food environments, where they get their food from. This includes all the lies that they tell us about the food that we can eat that will make you lose 20 kgs in 1 week, and all the wonderful stories they tell us about all sorts of other misleading issues. But it also includes what we are exposed to as consumers that affects our choices. What is affecting us to move away from our traditional and indigenous foods and gravitating towards foods that are giving us the statistics that I shared with you earlier on. We have to look at market systems across food environments, across different supply chains. How are those market systems actually working to deliver food systems, both from a nutrition and health perspective as outcomes, but also from environmental perspectives as well? Then we have to look at some of the things that need end-to-end approaches. Like I said, we're doing better on staples. And it's not even all staples. It's a few of them, because we are ignoring many of the staples that could actually help us adapt to the climate issues that we are facing right now. But fruits and vegetables fall in these categories. Animal source foods fall in that category. And the reason there is because these are areas where we are doing so badly. As I showed you on the Kenyan example that I showed you earlier, I could show you a same kind of figure for every other African country. It's similar. We are not having enough of certain foods, but also those might be the foods that we might not even pay enough attention to as part of our food systems resilience programs, or our CAADP, or whatever constellation of different policy instruments we may have in the different countries. Then there's also the issue of biofortified crops and health-enhancing staples. And I'm adding this one in particular because the African continent stands out. It's the one continent that has got a biofortification declaration and strategy. No other area, as far as I know, has got that. There's a lot of progress that has been made on this, but we could also forget all about it and not gain as much as we could from something that has actually worked. Yesterday in the hotel here, I had orange-fleshed sweet potatoes for breakfast. We are beginning to see some of these biofortified crops creeping into hotels and stuff like that. I want to see them at home, not at the hotel, because our people would benefit more from them. Then there is also the element of multi-sectoral platforms, multi-sectoral systems. We cannot deliver on nutrition outcomes without addressing other systems, water, health, and the like. If you feed the child the best food for complementary feeding and the water and sanitation issues are not addressed, child will be having diarrhea every other day. You will not meet those nutrition outcomes. And so when you are taking the systems approach, you need to think also in terms of other systems that are actually going to impact that. What are we doing with our water? If we have fertilizer runoff into water, we know we affect water quality. If we are not careful about what else is running into water in terms of chemicals and the like, a good example I think to give here is in a lot of places where there's been a lot of leather tanning industries developed, the water with all those chemicals running back into the river, and then the cow drinks that, it ends up in your meat or your milk and stuff like that. That's why it is important to take a systems approach to make sure that you have an overarching view of what is going on. And then finally, looking at transformative leadership for food systems transformation. And here what we are talking about is some of what we are trying to do in this room. Look at all the policy instruments that we have. How do they come together? How do we work with all these scenarios to try and direct progress of our food systems transformation in a positive direction? And then, of course, we need to be predictive, and so foresight analysis can help us to look at scenario analysis, create scenarios, perhaps things we haven't even thought about. Try them out. Stress testing is what we heard about earlier on. What is it that is possible? Having done this CAADP Kampala at a glance, I recommend you go and look for that document. It's quite informative. But here I want to bring what I have talked about into the Kampala Declaration, and specifically looking at our first commitment, which is to intensify sustainable food production, agro-industrialization, and trade. The question is, what kind of interventions do different countries have to address that? What do we need to do at continental level or at sub-regional level to address that? And is it possible to model some of these scenarios to help policymakers, to help countries assess where they might land with what they are currently doing, or where they might be overlooking some potential trade-offs that should be managed? We want to boost investment and financing for accelerated agri-food systems transformation. This is a loaded one. We are all crying about the funding landscape in the development sector right now. There are smart modelers in this room. Can you perhaps figure out scenarios that could help us? What kind of creative financing mechanisms can you try out in scenario analysis to see where that might actually take us? So being disruptive should also be a willingness for those that are modeling. Ensure food and nutrition security. I did tell you at a length about where our food systems are taking us in terms of food and nutrition security, so I won't say much more on that. Advancing inclusivity and equitable livelihoods. The sad part here is that the people who produce our foods are usually the ones that also go hungry, that don't eat as well as they could. Sometime back, I was associated with a project that was producing eggs from chickens at household level. The idea was to encourage women to produce layers, produce chickens, with the intention that the children's nutrition would change. What happened? The chickens were produced, the eggs were produced, and moms went and sold the eggs, and they bought sugar and brought home. So in terms of nutrition outcome, that was a major trade-off because we didn't think about addressing the issue fully from a systems perspective. Commitment 5 is to build resilient agri-food systems. I did talk about the fact that climate change is really wreaking havoc on this continent. Just a few years back, we had 5 consecutive growing seasons without rain in the Horn of Africa. Several countries were affected. So when we are thinking about building resilient agri-food systems, what exactly are we talking about? What do we need to bring into play? What must we try? Can you try something? First by modeling, and then talk to policymakers to say, perhaps you could try this. So that we can actually address that idea of building food systems resilience. But there's also the issue of using irrigation better, using solar energy better for people to have solar pumps for irrigation where they would otherwise not be able to. The question is, what are those elements that we could bring on board to strengthen our resilience? Then we need to strengthen agri-food systems themselves in their totality. So when we are talking about trade-offs and scenario analysis, these are some of the things you need to think about. If that's the solution, where might that take us? If it's not taking us in the right direction, then what else can we bring on board to make sure that we have equitable outcomes so that we can continue to have our food systems being resilient and we can strengthen their resilience? And with all this, predictive capacity is a good thing to have, and we need to think not only about the 6 CAADP commitments, but also the other instruments on climate, environment, biodiversity, trade, and other domains. We must not accept our current rate of progress. And we can, hopefully, use foresight to move us in that direction. Thank you very much.